welcome to Canonical. Today we are reviewing Sag Harbor by Colson Whitehead. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris.
Hello.
Hi, Iad, and Sam Spieler.
Hi.
Hi, Sam. So today we are starting our series on race in contemporary America with Sag Harbor. Before we begin, though, Sam will talk a little bit about her decision to tackle this topic, because this series is obviously informed by the recent protests of police violence against African Americans in particular, but also more broadly about the treatment of minorities in America. Usually we would jump right into the discussion about the book, but I thought it would be good for us to discuss our thoughts about the protests and how these issues have affected us personally. So, Sam, can you start us off?
Yeah, sure. Race has always been an important issue, but clearly even more so at this moment in history. I think our politics and stances will become clear as we discuss these novels that we've chosen for this series on race in contemporary America. But we felt there would be some value in speaking more plainly about it from the beginning. The moral fact is that Black lives matter as much as any lives can matter. We have to assert this now in whatever ways we can because lives are at stake. If you're very fortunate, like me, not to immediately understand how critically lives are in danger, the best way to understand is to let others speak about the ongoing fear that is part of their reality and pay attention to what they are saying. Even when people express this fear in ways we disagree with, we have to remember the process of justice is messy and complex. It requires a type of civic action that is increasingly rare in modern America, the action of moving forward where institutions haven't cleared a path. More importantly, it requires a sincere effort to empathize with people very different from you. Considering the progress we've made since Jim Crow in the 1960s, or the lack thereof in a lot of cases, this is obviously going to continue being a long, drawn-out, painful process. Time will tell whether America will rise to meet that challenge, but there's nothing worth doing more. The protests specifically have become a big point of contention between people of different races, creeds, classes, and other factions, and it will keep being a point of contention as long as there is inequality in this country, which says to me there will always be a disconnect. But if we approach each other with an open mind and try to move beyond the politics and actually start discussing the underlying problems and doing something about them rather than automatically pushing back out of frustration or anger, I think the rewards of a truly equitable society are limitless. But we do have to try collectively, and we aren't quite there yet.
Thank you, Sam. So I think, you speak for all of us with your statement. So let's talk now about the book, Sag Harbor. So since this was your choice, can you start us off by talking a little bit about Colson Whitehead and Sag Harbor?
Yeah. Colson Whitehead is an interesting writer. I hadn't really thought much about him until I selected this book. He's had this charmed life that a lot of writers would dream about. He grew up in Manhattan, wealthy family, went to a prep school, spent his summers on Sag Harbor, just like Benji in the novel that we're going to talk about today. From the outside, at least, it seems like he's had a very good life. He came to public attention in 2016 when Barack Obama chose his novel The Underground Railroad as one of his favorite books of the year. This was back when the U.S. had a president who was kind of a literary tastemaker. That book was very successful. It won Whitehead his first Pulitzer Prize in 2017, I believe. And then a few years later, he actually entered that rare league of writers to win a second Pulitzer Prize. I think the only one I know who's won two is Faulkner. I think Faulkner also won 2 Pulitzer Prizes.
Updike.
Updike won. Oh,
yes.
Good for Updike.
There's like 3 other writers, I believe. I don't know about Faulkner, but Updike definitely has 2.
But it's still rare.
In any case, it's definitely a very, very select few. This book is especially interesting to me. It's not one of his most famous works, but I think it presents a view of blackness and a view of Black male experience that isn't often seen in public. It's upper middle and upper class Black people living a type of life that it seems is usually reserved just for white people, summering and having summer homes and spending time away from the city and recreation. And that to me was very appealing because I wanted to see a Black experience that was unique and unfamiliar to me. And I'm glad that I chose this novel and had a chance to see a different side of things.
I believe our current president enjoys the Bible.
Oh, at least he claims to.
As a prop, at least.
It is the most popular book, the best-selling book in the world yet, so you could call him a literary tastemaker.
In his words, there's a lot of good stuff in there. So who am I to judge?
A stellar review.
Yeah.
10 out of 10.
Hopefully we'll strive for maybe a more in-depth review here of Sag Harbor. Since this was your pick, Ed, maybe you can give us your review of the book first.
The thing that I loved most about this book, the thing that was the most immediately appealing to me was its conversational tone. The book speaks to you in intimate tones. It's like a friend. It's like somebody who is close enough to you to joke about things, but also close enough to you to share their deeper feelings, to share their secret heartache and whatever insecurities they might have. And I feel the way the narrator approaches the story is very inviting in that way. It reminded me a lot of, in Junot Diaz's work, the character Junior, who always kind of invites the reader to understand more about Dominican culture and Dominican slang. It also reminded me a lot of the narration in Zadie Smith's debut novel, White Teeth, where there is a lot of discussion of London slang and the slang used by young Londoners, usually people of color in London, and kind of explaining their world and how they talk to each other. That I felt was really well done. One thing I didn't enjoy as much is the kind of aimless pacing of the novel. What I thought was it was realistic in the sense that the novel has a very limited scope. It aims to show you one summer in one young man's life, and it very deliberately focuses on a period between Memorial Day at the beginning of the novel and Labor Day at the end of the novel. But the events aren't ordered in any particular structure. There is no real center to the novel. There is no especially important event that happens to Benji when he's out there on Sag Harbor. I also think that he doesn't really change as much. There isn't a lot of character development. Now, is it really realistic to expect a lot of character development in 3 months? Probably not, but it didn't make for an especially compelling reading experience. It was very realistic, but also uncompelling to me.
One of the reviews I read said that this was a nonfiction book in a novel's disguise because the 8 chapters were kind of ordered by topic or subject matter, and it didn't really have that novel's through line, and each individual essay or chapter was sort of standalone, and you didn't really need all of them in place or in that specific order even. Did you feel the same way, Ed?
I think I did. I think that it could be considered similar to a collection of interrelated stories. Each part of the novel is a standalone unit. They don't build on each other in any significant way. I do think that Benji as a character is so interesting that I think it's more rewarding to have read the whole thing rather than to read just a part of it. But at the same time, if you read only one part of it, I think there wouldn't be a lot of magic lost.
I guess I agree with that they kind of operate as independent essays, fictional essays. But yeah, I agree that it wasn't as compelling and it wasn't as ambitious maybe as I imagine his other works are. But I really enjoyed how this was just a typical teenager's life. It's about race and it's not about race at the same time because it's just a teenage boy's summer, and that's about it. He happens to be Black, so there are things about race in there, but it seemed to me that one of Colson's points was that this is just a typical teenager. It doesn't have to be always this big drawn out point to be made. It's a kid's life.
One thing I want to ask you two about is the connection between Benji, the character, and Whitehead, the writer. Now, there are some very clear parallels, but how closely do you think we're meant to connect one to the other?
What do you mean by meant to? Do you mean
Well,
should the reader expect this to be Colson?
Meant to is obviously a loaded term. Let's just say, do you think the reader is on the right track if he just looks at Benji and says, well, this is what Whitehead experienced?
I think yes, in that the details are so vivid that it seems like it's a recollection of his summers in Sag Harbor. Because, like I said, a lot of the reviews cover this, where it almost feels like it's a memoir or a nonfiction essay. So yeah, I think they are very closely linked. Something else that I thought was interesting, it's kind of more in the literary gossip column of, news, I guess, is that Colson doesn't talk a lot about his family. This is one of his most candid books that addresses elements of his family. And I think that's kind of interesting because he's alluded to like different elements of his family life, and people kind of speculate as to, like what's going on there. And I don't want to get into it because it feels very gossip braggy. But yeah, I think the consensus, not just my own reading, but I feel like the consensus when I read other reviews of this book is that it is very much his lived experience that's been altered a bit. And I think he said as much in interviews.
Yeah, that's how I took it as well. And it did sound from interviews like that was true, that he used the format of a novel, but I think as you put it earlier, it's nonfiction parading itself as fiction.
There was a reviewer who I thought was being a bit harsh, but he pretty much said that Colson should have written this as a nonfiction or a memoir, but he just didn't have the guts to do it.
Yeah, I don't think that's completely fair either. I think that that's expecting a lot. That's demanding something from a writer that the writer obviously didn't want to do. And turning it into a novel allows for certain freedoms that he wouldn't have otherwise. Look at what happened with James Frey. Was that his name?
Yes. Yeah.
Who had
Million Little Pieces.
Yeah. And that's kind of this, but in reverse, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. If he had written a straight memoir, maybe someone from his past would have come out and said, that's not how it happened, no matter how factual it might be to the writer.
Yeah, but no one cares about that person. When that person wins a Pulitzer Prize, he can get back to Colson, I think.
He has to win too, actually.
Yeah.
I think there is some value, though, I think just for somebody trying to decide how they feel about this book to make a distinction between a memoir and a novel. Because I think when you set out to write a memoir, built into the memoir format is the fact that I am telling you this story because this is my story. And when you're writing a novel, you are telling the story in a different way. I'm saying, this is an important story, and I want you to pay attention to it. And it's not necessarily important because I lived it, but I think that the ideas are important. And I think that there is a political aspect to this novel. It's not on the surface, but there is maybe a subtextual political aspect to this novel. And if it's written as a novel, I think that requires Whitehead to push his politics to the forefront more than if it's written as a memoir.
That actually brings up something that I wanted to talk about, something I saw in a couple different reviews, how he approaches a deeper point, but stops short of full commentary. Every chapter in this has something in that line, such as families fighting and breaking apart, his dad drinking and musing on women, Barry David, the teenager at the end of the book that no one knows where he comes from, he just appears. Black-white relations, for sure, come up, but it's not really central to the story because, again, as you mentioned, it's just a teenage boy's life one summer.
Yeah, I think that's done very knowingly. I think he knows that when you get to those scenes, you're expecting a certain type of event to take place. Like in the middle of the novel, one of the kind of the centerpieces is when the boys are playing with BB guns. And you just imagine a group of black boys running through the streets with guns in their hands, and you're like, oh no, this is going to end badly.
He definitely plays with your expectations, yeah.
Yeah, or later on, they go into a house that they shouldn't go into. And again, you're expecting the typical sort of black experience where, oh no, don't go into that house. You shouldn't be there. But, again, it's not as terrible as you might imagine. So I feel like that's maybe not chosen. I think I agree with you guys. These are things that actually happened to him. But I think placing them in the novel is done deliberately to kind of build up your expectation for some traumatic or significant event that is always undercut on purpose.
Did you like that undercutting?
I thought it was good in the sense that it kept me in check. It was a writer who knew what his reader would be thinking of, and he was managing my expectations in what I felt was a very deliberate way, but not a heavy-handed way.
What did you think, Sam?
I agree. It's subversive, but it's not subversive in a very shocking way. I kind of worried about that and worried about my expectations, what I was bringing to the novel, rather than just letting the novel speak for itself. But I definitely enjoyed that. I liked having my expectations flipped on its head. I didn't think that was a problem necessarily. It was a very enjoyable read throughout, even though it took me a little bit at the beginning to understand that, okay, this is not trying to teach me something necessarily about race relations. This is not trying to teach me something about what it's like in living in Harlem. This is a different sort of book. And once I got past that point, all that was left was an enjoyable read.
Even though, Sam, you're saying that the novel doesn't explicitly aim to teach people anything about race or race relations, there is a historical aspect of the novel that I wasn't immediately aware. Sag Harbor in New York is actually a very interesting place. In the middle of the 20th century, upper class and educated professional African Americans wanted a place in the countryside to relax, people from the New York metro area. But they were largely excluded from the Hamptons proper. They were excluded from East Hampton and Southampton, the more popular places that we know about in media where all of the super rich hang out. But they were able to buy plots of land nearby, a little bit further inland on Long Island in Sag Harbor. And there were these neighborhoods that people were able to develop. And I think it's very significant to me to think of the history of this kind of Black utopia, if we want to call it a Black utopia, of upper class, educated, professional Black people living a lifestyle that's very distinct, but also living a lifestyle more or less separate from white people. There is a tension in the novel, I think, especially when they see white people on the beach, that I think is important to look at. Like, what is the value to these people of having a space for themselves separate from white people? And another thing I noticed as I kind of looked further into the novel is that these spaces are actually disappearing. A lot of white people have started to move into these Sag Harbor neighborhoods, and they're not really the segregated places that they once were.
Yeah, I found that interesting as well. And you shared an article detailing that last point about how these spaces are disappearing. And something I thought was interesting about that is that it's a mix of two problems. There's the problem of Black people being pushed out of these historically Black enclaves where they had their own way of life, their own communities that are now being invaded by white people. But on top of that, there's also just the normal issue of developers coming in and taking what used to be family land, family houses, and turning it into this developed, seaside retreat for any old rich person. They're sort of one and the same, but it's complicated because of the race. It's complicated because this was a Black sanctuary of sorts.
So we'll share that article in our subreddit. So if you're listening to us, you can find us on Reddit at Canonical Pod, and we'll have a thread up for discussion. It'll also have our show notes where you can read this article. I'd like to ask you something. So you mentioned that you found the novel kind of aimless, right? Because it didn't have that plot through line. But I recall that all of us really enjoyed The Emissary because it also didn't have this plot through line. It had, it played around with language and expectations. So, what makes this novel different from The Emissary? Because both writers use language excellently, and both writers subvert expectations in different ways. So what is it that made this less enjoyable?
I think the difference between the two is that between TADA and Whitehead, I think that TADA is the stronger writer. I think that Whitehead, at least in this novel, doesn't show the same caliber of ideas that TADA has to work with. Both of them employ this sort of decentered lyrical style that we talked about in, I think it was episode 5 on Japanese fiction, but where TADA is moving from interesting idea to interesting idea. I feel like not all of Whitehead's ideas are as interesting as the others, and I think that he's just such a strong and confident storyteller that he kind of relies on his storytelling muscle to shove his way through the novel. Like, he's very, very skilled in terms of engaging you, but what he's using to engage you is not always as good as what TADA is using.
I disagree with that a little bit. I think one of the strengths of Whitehead from this novel, because I haven't read any of his other novels, is I think his sentences and paragraphs are really, really strong. And I think he might even be the strongest writer on the sentence level that I've read maybe this whole year, including The Emissary. I think his images are not very strong, whereas TADA is very evocative. I think that Colson Whitehead isn't that evocative because he relies on a lot of cultural references that he expects you to either get or don't. And because his sentences are so strong, even if you don't get it, you'll just go along with it. That's how I would differentiate the two. But I really, really did enjoy his writing. Like, when I read this book, I thought, okay, if he has this hands on a topic and really digs into it and not have this kind of weird meandering pace, he's gonna like knock it out of the park, because his writing his sentences are so good that it makes me really jealous. I read it and I think I want to write because I can do this, and obviously I can't, but he is so good that you just think, oh my God, like, why didn't I just do this? It's so simple.
He's very personal.
No,
He's
I
very
agree with
personable.
He's an incredibly strong writer. I don't disagree with it. He's a strong writer, but I think that maybe the experiment of this novel is for him to say, I'm going to write this novel with one of my hands basically tied behind my back. I'm going to muscle through this whole thing, not focusing on plotting or any sort of pacing, but just focusing on my own storytelling, even down to the sentence level, like how strong I am as a writer. In his other work, I haven't read it either, but I think in his other work, we may find that he exceeds TADA. But in this work specifically, I don't think he does, because of this perhaps artificial limitation that he set for himself.
Yeah, he kind of shoots himself in the foot by taking that experimentation on. It's an interesting experimentation, but ultimately, as many reviewers pointed out, that plotlessness does hinder him quite a bit. I feel the same way as you did, James, that I really enjoyed this and was not put off by the plotlessness, but it did feel lacking in some way because of that. And I can imagine his other works, like The Nickel Boys or The Underground Railroad, probably don't suffer from that in the same way.
I think all three of us really liked The Emissary, and it was similarly plotless. But this novel, I would say, might even have a little bit more of a plot in some ways, or at least it has more tension than The Emissary, especially that one section where you think, oh, he's going to get abused by his father. That chapter was really suspenseful for me. Like the way he just used the what was it? The sounds, right? The sound of the cabinet opening and closing.
Right.
It just really layered the suspense for me. I just think that's interesting. I don't really have any conclusions because I think I enjoyed The Emissary more, but I can't say why. it's something I need to think about more. One thing I will say is I really did enjoy this novel. And what I enjoyed besides the language was the fact that it used retrospective narration, and it's a novel about a place. And if you guys know me and like what I enjoy in fiction, those are my two weak points. I have a really soft spot for those two kinds of novels. And so like this is right in my wheelhouse. I just love books about places, and I just love retrospective narration, especially like coming of age type stories. And what I didn't like so much was all the cultural references, especially at the beginning. I just thought it was overwhelming. What did you guys think about that?
That didn't bother me because of the kind of story he was trying to tell, that this is a teenager's 3 months of summer in 1985. And I'm usually put off by name dropping, but I didn't feel like it was name dropping here. It felt like it was integral to the story for me, that all those kinds of things are really important to a teenager, especially a teenager that goes to school, in New York. This is his life, especially a nerdy teenager that's trying to move from Dungeons and Dragons into hip hop. It's going to be fraught with those kinds of references.
I think this is something that we'll probably have to get into in our next episode, where we dive deeper into the themes of this novel. But I do think that the cultural references in the novel have two kind of political aspects. The first aspect is in the chapter where he's talking about dag and he's explaining this piece of slang. There is a sense that this is not written by Black people for Black people, but written by Black people for outsiders. And that to me was a source of tension, only in that I would want to feel like he was communicating with somebody in a more kind of fraternal way, like speaking among friends, rather than speaking among people in the group to people outside of the group. Because if you come to this novel like me, already knowing what dag means, not to kind of boast too much, but I did know dag, it is kind of like, oh, well, I'm going to let you in on some Black knowledge, some secret knowledge, And that to me is kind of, it's awkward. I don't know exactly how I feel about it yet, but that's the first kind of political issue, the racial politics at play, is that there is a sense that this novel is about Black people, but not necessarily for Black people.
Yeah.
Whatever it means for something to be for Black people is a separate issue, but I do think there is a sense that the intended reader might not be of the same community as the writer. The second political issue, is when he's talking about rap music. Specifically, there is a comparison between Run DMC and gangster rap. He talks about a NWA track later on in the novel. And it's very clear to me in my reading that the author's politics, and maybe this is not the author's politics, but at least Benji's politics, are in favor of this kind of non-confrontational party vibe that we get from Run DMC, and much more condemning of the aggressive and violent tones that we find in NWA. So it does speak to a preference for a certain type of culture. And that, to me, I think is important in the novel, whether or not you agree with it. And I think it requires the inclusion of some aspects of Black pop culture.
All right, well, yeah, let me stop you here. We'll get more in depth on this topic next episode in our discussion episode on Sag Harbor. We'll take a break right now. We'll be back shortly, and we'll talk about this work in the context of his other novels. So we'll be right back. Welcome back. So this book, Sag Harbor, was published before the Underground Railroad and the Nickel Boys, both of which won the Pulitzer Prize. And those two novels both address heavy themes of systemic racism and abuse head on, whereas this one was more circumspect in its investigation of ideas. Do you think that this book will gain more attention in the future?
I don't think so. It's not that old, and it's already kind of forgotten. I feel like those two novels that you mentioned are really the novels that people are focusing on when it comes to Colson Whitehead. I was having difficulty finding people on the internet who were talking about Sag Harbor.
Yeah, it definitely seemed, as we talked about, this was an experiment of sorts for him, and that it resonated with people in terms of prose and, like you said, his sentence level writing. But from a message standpoint, people didn't respond to it quite as strongly.
One thing I noticed about him is that he's very experimental in the sense that he doesn't want to rely on the same type of novel. Like he told an interviewer in an interview that I watched, once I had written one novel, there's no reason to try to write that again. So I think that even though he's successful with these novels that are much more directly about racism and systemic racism, I don't know if that's necessarily what he's going to continue doing in the future. I think there might be a more varied output from him in the future.
I wonder if more people will read this novel just because it's more autobiographical. He does have some nonfiction works out there, but I mean, he winning 2 Pulitzer Prizes, he's only, in his 50s. I mean, he's like a huge name in the literary world now, and you have people nowadays trying to dig up all these old letters from like Faulkner and Hemingway and studying them. So I wonder.
Oh, for sure. It'll get studied as like runoff at the very least.
Well, not even just runoff, but just because it's so autobiographical. I wonder if that's what gets it some traction.
It's possible. I mean, it depends on how big the Colson Whitehead brand gets in academic circles. I think that we're still too close to his novels to tell what kind of impact it will have on the academic world. But if his work in general has a lasting impact, then Sag Harbor definitely will.
Okay, so both of you guys said that you liked this novel. If you had to rate it on a scale of, let's say, 10 points, and The Emissary, which we all loved, is like up there at 9 or 10, where would you put this?
This is probably an 8.
I was about to say the same thing, yeah.
Oh, interesting. I was actually expecting your score to be a bit lower, Ed, from what you said earlier.
I think it's a very interesting novel. When I approach a novel and I have a lot of things to say that sound critical, it doesn't mean that I didn't like it. For me, the novel that I hate the most would be the novel that I have nothing to say about because it didn't make me think anything.
So who would you recommend this novel to? Because I don't think it's for everyone, even though it is easy to read in certain ways.
I would recommend it to Black friends. I would recommend it to people who don't understand Black people in general, because this is something that we had talked about previously when we were talking about the social power of fiction. This novel is very good because it presents a Black young man in a very complicated and in-depth way. And I think that when you have the experience of knowing Benji for as long as we have, it's very difficult to hate him. It's very difficult to not have sympathy for him. And I think that that's really important.
I agree, although I don't know that I would evangelize it to Black friends. If I were close with them, I might mention it and say that it was good, but bringing it up out of nowhere and singing its praises would sound, this book specifically feels a little to me like a white person trying to tell a Black person what the Black experience is.
It does have a certain perspective, yeah. It's not necessarily our perspective, but maybe Colson Whitehead's perspective.
Right. I would definitely recommend it to certainly everyone in my circle. It feels to me like it is written for everyone, but its audience isn't everyone, if that makes sense. It's very approachable. He takes great pains to make Ben this lovable character, like you say. But even for Black people who this would be new to, it's not going to necessarily be a new experience.
I guess it's my turn to be a bit critical because I actually wouldn't recommend this to everybody. I think a lot of people who read novels for plot would just be super bored by this book.
Oh, yeah.
I actually found it hard to continue, not because I disliked it, but because it just never gripped me. I just went from page to page, and the writing is so good that whenever you pick up the pages, you just continue where you were. And it really didn't matter what the last 10 pages was about because you can just follow along with the gorgeous prose, but there wasn't really much plot to speak of. The only chapter that really gripped me, besides the BB gun one, I think that one was interesting, but the one I mentioned earlier with the father at home grilling, like that chapter really held my attention throughout. But I mean, for me, it was not a slog because it was enjoyable, but it certainly didn't compel me to read more. I think I read it because the writing was so good, but I wasn't curious to learn more or anything like that. In a way, actually, and this sounds bad, but I don't mean it in a very negative way. This just feels like Happy Days or what was that other show in the 90s looking back at the 70s? The Wonder
70s
Years.
show.
No. The Wonder Years. The 70s shows was even later. It was 2000s. But this felt like that Happy Days or Wonder Years. It felt like it had that kind of very nice...
Nostalgic.
Definitely nostalgic, but just kind of a nice presentation of a very complicated period of history. So... yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it to everyone, to be honest. I feel like a lot of people would start and just not finish the book. Did you guys get that kind of feeling of Happy Days or The Wonder Years, where it's a not very complicated portrayal of a kid kind of coming to age or maybe not really sure? Did you have that same kind of feeling as you were reading it?
I did, but I think that it works for me because I read the novel in the context of the way the Black experience is portrayed in other media. In contrast to other media, I think that this is a good counterbalance.
Yeah, and there are hints at something else. There are hints at that tension, not just him playing with your expectations, but we'll talk about this more in the next episode, but like the dad's drinking and like the buried David character, there are these hints at something darker, but that shying away from it, it's frustrating, but it's also an interesting counterbalance, the way you had put it.
Okay, well, let's stop here then. We have a lot to get to next episode, sounds like. If you want to get more updates on our next episodes or updates about our schedule, you can find us on social media at Canonical Pod. We also have a subreddit for discussion on Reddit at our Canonical Pod, and we'd love to hear from you. We'll be back next week with a discussion on Sag Harbor. If you're interested in following our in-depth discussion, please go ahead and find a copy of that book. If you want to support us, you can use our affiliate link. It is on our subreddit discussion thread, and you'll find the link to our subreddit below in the show notes. Till next time, happy reading, and we'll talk to you soon.